Welcome to the third season of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast where we explore the fascinating borderlands between science and theology through realms of philosophy, human experience, and more. Welcome back to That's So Second Millennium, episode 119. According to my search of the files, this is only our third rerun episode, so frankly I think we're doing pretty well. This month of February 2021 is a pretty busy one for both Bill and I. Bill is, teaching at Holy Cross College and a bunch of other things. Honestly, we've gotten a little bit out of touch since I started working at a consulting firm in St. Louis, Missouri, this past month. As most of you, anyone who's worked in a consulting firm knows, that's usually, large amounts of terror. So I've been a little busy. I have the very good fortune that the week after next, I'm recording this on February 7th, so I'm calling next week the week of the 7th to the 13th, and so the week following the 14th, I'm going to have the chance to go to Wyoming Catholic College in Lander, Wyoming, and give a talk and guest teach a class. Give a talk outside in February in Wyoming. That'll be exciting. I've been to Wyoming twice, but only in the summertime, so I'm going to find out what February in Wyoming is like. And part of me is really excited about that, and part of me is really not looking forward to being cold. But without bravery, nothing good ever happens. Face the fear as we must. So, with that on my mind, I'm going to go reach all the way back into the archives and bring out episode number 6, one of our, in the auditory archives, one of the better listened to episodes about evolution in both geology and Christianity.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 6 of That's So Second Millennium. This is our podcast exploring frontiers of faith and reason, science and religion. And I'm Bill Schmidt.
I'm Paul Giesting.
And exactly, Paul Giesting is Dr. Paul Giesting is not only our co-host, but a faith-filled PhD geologist, and has spent many years doing some deep thinking about both science and spirituality and metaphysics. And last episode, we had a very good discussion going about evolution. I wanted to continue with that in this episode, if that's okay, Paul.
Sure.
I guess you ended the episode on a tantalizing note of the idea of evolution, far from some former faith-based views that evolution was a no-no. Evolution can indeed be an ambassador to the culture at large, and I wanted to ask you to maybe expand on that a little bit.
Well, so the term evolution, it comes from, obviously it comes from the Latin, so volvere, to turn, and you stick an E in front of it, you get evolution, to turn outward. So the definition, of the word in Latin, the cognate words in Latin would be sort of a turning out, and of course, if you've ever read the Aeneid, you can, if you ever had a chance to read the Aeneid in Latin, like I believe I said earlier, Virgil uses the word volvere in its forms to mean all sorts of motion or change. And so likewise, this word could mean a whole bunch of things. But, one typical meaning might be a flower unfurling, right? So you have a flower bud and it volvere, it turns, it opens up and it turns, the petals turn around and they turn outward. And so that's, one of the classic sort of pictures you would get of the word, in its earlier, and its Latin meaning, its classical Latin meaning, and then, it would preserve this meaning through medieval times. And then we would borrow it and start using it, as we've done since the Renaissance, taken these Greek and Latin terms and started using them in these technical senses. So there's nothing about that. I mean, that's already, gosh, if you sit and think about it, what is Christian doctrine about, what was the Old Testament, right? But it was progressive revelation of God, in different ways. And, by the time you've racked up all of the different books, all of the different literary styles and all the different approaches, everything from the historical books, the narratives, the law, the Mosaic law, the Psalms, core piece of the Old Testament, and then all the different prophetic writings and the wisdom literature, and all of the and the prophetic writings ranging from fairly straightforward Jeremiah, say, telling the people to stop reverencing idols, to stop their whatever perverse sexual or economic practices, all the way to the stories, Daniel, the quote prophet, with the stories that have been collected there, the narratives there, and the sort of parables. Whether the book of Judith, is practically one long parable where all of the enemies of Israel kind of rolled up together and turned into this super enemy army that comes and besieges this little town, and God saves it through the mechanism of Judith. So all of that progressively unfurls. You learn things from different books of the Old Testament. So you could read Hosea, and that whole tender, touching description of God's care for Israel as the care of a parent for a child. Compared to that's showing a different aspect of God than it is than say the Exodus narrative, where the Israelites are there before this frightening smoking mountain.
Right.
So that's always been, of course, that's been part of Christian understanding of the Old Testament since there's been Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's certainly definitive stages. Evolution passes certain milestones, and things are never the same afterward. Evolution is just like our discussion about shades of gray. Evolution isn't just a anywhere, everywhere. That's what some people seem to want it to be. But in fact, it progresses, it passes certain levels of complexity, and things are never the same. Even if you think about biological evolution, the change from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, from these, simple little, relatively undifferentiated cells, although even they are, amazing, complex entities, with all those chemical reactions of, thousands and thousands of different types to, just to run a bacterium. But then you go up to a protist with a nucleus and organelles, and things are just never the same. Things are there's the old level of simplicity is still there. Bacteria are still with us, but the new complexity has changed things. Multicellular life appears and has changed things permanently. We haven't gone back to there being not multicellular life, and even though individual multicelled organisms have died out, that process is still continued. And so we, I bring that up to say, in Christian understanding, there was a definitive stage of the New Testament, right? But there's, revelation, that there's a sense of revelation that's closed. To tie it back to the biological metaphor, how are you going to get more multicelled than multicelled, right? Once you can stack cells together, you can just keep stacking cells together until you have a blue whale, or in something even bigger than that. There's no intrinsic rule. So we now have all of that. That was a point in time at which we passed one of these milestones. But it's not as if things don't keep changing, right? So we can maybe wind up the episode with some of that, discussion. I think there's some things I'd like to save for that, perhaps.
Okay. Well, would it help to concretize this evolutionary principle right away with just a sampling of how it fits in with your own field of geology?
Yeah, I mean, this is an example. I don't know, it was maybe, trying to calculate back, not quite 10 years ago. I was at a conference, and I noticed, wandering around the poster session, if you've never been to a scientific conference, certainly the ones that I've been to in geology, they are structured, so most people have a 15-minute talk, and you're supposed to leave time for questions at the end. So they are bang, 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 bang.
Yeah.
And then there are poster sessions, and often they're going simultaneously. So you could have, depending on the conference, at the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco every December, oh gosh, there must be at least 40 talks running simultaneously, and a poster session with thousands of posters. It's some subset of people standing by their poster at any given. In fact, you usually have to actually take your poster down. That's a conference with, I think anymore, it's 20+ thousand people. So it's a big deal. There are lots of smaller ones. But you go and, so the concept of a poster, let me not get too far off track, right? So you just have your scientific work, you often make it in individual slides and sort of have a progression through, it's like a hybrid between it's obviously a poster, but it's also a scientific paper / a talk. All of those elements sort of feed into it. So a well-constructed poster, it has a little bit of text, and it has a lot of images that, help give you, that illustrate the points that you're trying to make. You usually have a little bit of an abstract to say, this is what we found. And then unlike a scientific paper, almost all of your explanation is just in terms of the figures. But anyway, so I was wandering around the poster session, and I realized that, there was a new trend of the evolution of minerals, because evolution is such a cool, hip term that this is to some degree my old, sardonic self looking at this and saying, this is so, we must take this trendy term and apply it to our own discipline somehow. But, honestly, there's actually a lot to it. So if you think about the Earth and the history of the Earth from a geological perspective, so what happened? So there's a solar nebula, and the first things, as far as we can tell, it was actually, a lot of it was vaporized. A lot of it must have been hot enough, and of course thin enough, which is key. As long as things are at ultra low pressure, billionths of an atmosphere or less, then things can stay in essentially the gas phase, simply because atoms don't crash into each other in order to condense into crystals. But once some shock was applied, I think that's still a hypothesis that perhaps there was a nearby supernova. Those were handy for all sorts of reasons. They would also salt the nebula with extra elements. And in fact, something must have done that in the very near term, before the condensation of the solar system, because we have isotopes like aluminum-26, that only live a few million years. And evidence, the daughter isotopes for them are still present in rocks in ways that only make sense if the universe, or if the solar system condensed out of something that had been recently hit by a supernova and therefore salted with that isotope. So you get a certain chemistry. So you get this kind of averaged chemistry, and it's very, very what we would call reducing. So at Earth's, what happens to an iron implement in Earth's atmosphere? It rusts, right?
Right.
A solid iron is not stable. But iron is iron is kind of the last element that stars make before they go haywire, because there is kind of an energy low in the periodic table that if you take hydrogen and build it into helium, you drop the energy per, particle in the nucleus by a lot. And if you stack 3 heliums together to form a carbon, or 4 to form an oxygen atom, you then drop it even more. You build silicon, you build magnesium, you build sulfur, on up the chain, until you get to iron. If you fuse stuff together to make iron, you have reached basically the energy minimum per proton or neutron for the nucleus. If you then start trying to fuse stuff to iron, you lose energy. You go back up you're going back up a slope, and you now have to feed more energy to it than you get out of it. And instead of, and so what happens, when a star is burning, there's this balance between the gravity, because stars are big, the whole mass of the star is trying to, weigh down on the core, but the core is releasing all of this energy. It's, millions of degrees, and so that generates this sort of balance that keeps the star at about the size that it is. So a supernova happens when you start trying to fuse iron, and the whole game, goes to hell. The iron starts to, you're fusing iron to make heavier elements, and you start to lose energy, and the star contracts in on itself, and eventually you bounce off of some quantum physics, phenomenon such as just neutron degeneracy, which, in sort of layman's terms would mean that you can't cram the neutrons any closer together because they're as tight as they can possibly be. Bit of a simplification, but it's pretty close. And so the star will almost bounce off itself, and then you get a supernova. At least that's is, or at least was in the last few decades, a going hypothesis for how supernovas work. So in this this is the only context where you can make all these heavy elements. We wouldn't have lead, for example, if it wasn't for supernovas. It's the only place that can happen. But all of that's to say there's a lot of iron, because that's, what the core of the star has made itself into when it reaches this last stage. So there's a lot of iron in the early solar system, and, iron is reduced. So what the planets originally condensed out of is stuff that's, fairly alien to what we see, at Earth's surface today, because we live in this atmosphere of pure, pure, but we have uncombined oxygen in our atmosphere along with the nitrogen and other stuff. So as a planet, so if you take Mars is a good example because it doesn't have this oxygen atmosphere. Nevertheless, its surface is different than its core or meteorites because the planet sorted itself out. So you started with this pile of rubble. It had iron, it had a lot of sulfur. I mentioned that in passing, that's another stage in the process. It's another benchmark. All the elements have different abundances because, basically because they're generated in different proportions in stars. Some are easy to make and some are harder to make. The easy ones we have more of. So there's a lot of sulfides and iron. And so once when you take the distributed particles in a nebula and condense them together, you basically get gravitational potential energy out of that. So if you think of a bullet, you take a bullet, you shoot it at a metal target, what happens? You've maybe never done this, Bill. I have a target out here at the farm. My friend Aaron comes down from Indianapolis, and we shoot occasionally at these targets that my dad's cousin set up, a long time ago. What happens is you get a crater, right? But if you go up and touch that metal plate right after you've shot a .38 bullet at it, it's warm. There's a lot of energy that, started in the gunpowder and then was transferred to the bullet, and then when the bullet hits this metal plate, the energy's got to go somewhere. Where it goes is heat. And so if you have two particles, if you have two meteors or meteorites or meteoroids, let me get it right, before they crash to Earth, they're meteoroids. If they crash into each other, they release a certain amount of potential energy depending on their speed. And that's the mechanism by which that sort of gravitational potential energy gets turned into heat. So by the time you've piled up a planet, it gets warm enough on the inside that the iron and the sulfides can start to melt. And so what are they going to do? They're going to trickle down. Well, that releases more gravitational potential energy because now you're taking the heavy stuff, sorting it down toward the bottom, and that's more stable. And so the mechanism for that is that it actually rubs a little bit past the mineral particles that the molten iron and sulfur are going by. There's this great poetic name for it in this National Geographic book I read back in the day. They called it the iron catastrophe. It's a great name. It's fantastic. So the planet turns itself inside out. Now, people don't usually use that term. I haven't seen the term since, sadly, in the scientific literature, which is, like Calvin and Hobbes, the Calvin and Hobbes strip where Calvin says scientists should call the Big Bang the horrendous space kablooey. The missed opportunity. The iron catastrophe is fantastic. But anyway, so the planet turns itself inside out, and that means the iron has all gone down to the bottom. So if you look at Mars, to take us back to Mars, Mars went through this process. Mars is a differentiated planet. It's big enough for that. So it's got a core down there. but the rest of what's left behind is no longer in contact with metallic iron. And so the planet sorts itself out into layers, and new minerals start to grow in these new environments. So there actually is, as a planet ages, even a planet like Mars that isn't being affected by life, the number of minerals that you get with time, goes up. There are more different minerals. There are minerals down in the core and the lower mantle that are in contact. They're really reduced. And then you have minerals at the surface that are more oxidized. And in the case of Mars, that thin little atmosphere allows a lot of, solar wind and ultraviolet radiation through. And that actually pops electrons away, which is how things get oxidized. That's what that actually technically means. It means it has fewer electrons per atom than it otherwise would. That's, again, a bit of a simplification, but it's broadly true. So you get the iron oxidized, it loses electrons and becomes the red iron of rust that we're used to, and we look at Mars and we see that color. So that could never have happened in the original meteorites that Mars was generated from, but because of the evolution of this differentiated body, you wind up with different minerals. Simpler process than the evolution of life, but nevertheless still a noticeable principle. And then if you have a planet like Earth, which first of all we have liquid water at the surface, so that gives you an entire huge new classes of minerals that are accessible when rock reacts with liquid water. So we have hydroxides, we have clays, we have a lot of other silicate minerals that have a little bit of water in their structure in one form or another. Those are brand new minerals that would be difficult to generate in the original solar nebula, from the original sort of chondrules, little particles that first condensed out of the solar nebula. And then, of course, the cherry on top for us on Earth is that eventually life, and so here the evolution of biology is going in tandem with the evolution of minerals. Life starts generating oxygen, which of course is what allows the generation of eukaryotic cells, because they need so much energy to function. They need oxygen. That's the most efficient form of metabolism, is to take stuff in and burn sugars with oxygen, burn other organic compounds with oxygen, and then that also, the pumping of all that oxygen into the Earth's atmosphere means that we get superoxidized minerals that you'd never see anywhere else, unless you had such a strange alien planet as Earth. Because, if life could somehow evolve on sort of an ordinary podunk planet like Mercury or Mars or Venus, well, it would then turn its telescope at Earth and, get out its spectrometer and say, what in God's name is all of that oxygen? I mean, it'd be the same thing it'd be very similar to if we had an atmosphere full of chlorine gas. We're just so heavily prepared. Our cells are just so heavily armored against the burning, caustic effects of oxygen that we just don't think about it. The fact that things catch on fire in this atmosphere is, unbelievably unstable. You can't set things on fire in Venus's atmosphere, right? It's kind of counterintuitive. Venus is really hot, but how could you set anything on fire? It's just carbon dioxide. It's already stable and happy and as it can be. And if you take wood, what's wood going to do? Well, it's just going to sit there. However hot. It will destructively distill. It will, parts of it, the volatile parts of it will separate out. And you might wind up with something that looks sort of charcoal-ish, but it won't catch fire. So that's an example from geology that's sort of neat to think about. That everything in the universe is changing. Even a star goes through its own evolution and its own life cycle. And things, and the universe is not the same for there having been the star. Like I said, supernovas, but even ordinary. Smaller stars like the sun are changing. They're changing hydrogen into helium. They're changing if they get, if they're heavier, if they're as heavy as the sun. I think the sun is supposed to start burning helium to carbon and oxygen. It'll get at least that far. And if you have even bigger stars, then of course they make all the other elements of the periodic table. If it wasn't for stars, we would only have hydrogen and helium.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
But that's,
So,
and again, to bring that back to religion, that's kind of, and the religious person, looks at this and says, okay, that's the mechanism by which, that's the method, by which the divinity decided that things would, progress. Wrote, so to speak, these simple laws for the universe, and then they've piled, the objects that obey these laws pile themselves into larger and more diverse, structures. And that's not something that we need to be afraid of.
Yeah. So change is truly a constant in the universe. And I also like your point about how that's the developments in geology go hand in hand, in a sense, with the developments in biology. So change is a constant, and there's a certain holistic reality that is also a constant. Everything is connected to everything else, and religion seems to be a part of that.
Yeah, and the idea that that's that this progression of complexity is somehow opposed to religion is a very modern conceit. It was that people had a certain sort of fossilized idea. I mean, if you look at the first chapter of Genesis, with the structure, it's laying out things in terms of increasing complexity. It's sort of our natural expectation. We see that, and even the people at the time were aware to some extent of the progress of history, that they had started as individual people and gathered themselves into larger and larger political units. I mean, you can read the whole the book of Judges and the first book of Samuel. There's commentary on that, the evolution of human political structures. That often repeated comment in the book of Judges to explain whatever terrible thing has just happened. Several terrible things happened in the book of Judges. But in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone just did what he thought best.
Right. Right.
With the dry, implied, and it turned out really well, didn't it? Especially those episodes at the end. But yeah, that's getting a little too far astray.
All right.
But you think about. Sorry, what were you saying?
Well, no, I was going to say I think that the takeaway message a lot of people have from at least the Old Testament is, and I think even Jesus himself says or suggests this, that God is unchanging and that God's rules are unchanging. But it also sounds like one of God's rules does indeed not only envision but require change.
Yeah, and that's the strange thing, is how a universe where we've demonstrated to most people's satisfaction that disorder is always increasing, that entropy is always increasing, and yet the progress of the universe has been to more and more differentiated, specialized, organized objects, and that that entropy is being shed into the sort of intervening space, but it's still it's sort of delightfully contrarian,
Yeah.
the way God seems to have set these things up.
Yeah. So that idea that we often take away from religion about these silos that separate religion and science, that's an unnecessary entrapment of our thinking and our ability to understand the universe and to solve problems within the universe.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of it goes to, I think it's, the last 500 years of history of the West has been about a rebellion against the hypocrisy of, the church as it was in the 15th century,
Right.
being, the hypocrisy most notably economically and, in terms of political power, that the disciples, the people who are, leading the society in the name of, the most, the most humble, broke, persecuted prophet, this Jesus of Nazareth guy who spent 30 years as, a carpenter, and the first several years of his life as a refugee. And then he spends a few years wandering Judea, dodging attempts to give him political power. And then he gets nailed to a cross. And, on the way said several disparaging things about, the love of wealth in itself and how, rich people behave, bequeathed that legacy to his disciples who preserved it for us in the New Testament. I mean, go read the letter. One of many reasons to go read the letter of James again. And that these people were then, by the 15th century, ensconced in places of power, very comfortable, wealthy, gluttonous in a lot of cases. I mean, obviously this didn't describe everybody, but it was enough that people at large were, scandalized by it. And people took advantage of that and began this rebellion against, and that has continued, down to the present. And anything that can be used as a stick to beat that, that old hypocritical institution can and will be, used, whether it fits or not, whether it's really, suitable or not. And then, of course, once you get the Protestant churches, then people begin to rebel against the Protestant churches. And they'll, and then the political, the secular political structures that have, succeeded them, it's a bleak world that, the sort of, quote, progressive, mindset, or at least, a lot of people, or at least, an aspect of a lot of people's mindset seems to be this perpetual, everything's terrible, and it's just a question of identifying the next thing to rebel against. And criticism is good, and, we've certainly gotten a long way, but it's, it's worth worrying whether we've reached some sort of tipping point in terms of, have we stopped making progress, by simply looking at things and looking around for the next thing to tear down?
No, you're right. That's an all too common viewpoint still today, and it's interesting that that traces back at least to the 15th century, if not even earlier. It makes me think of a certain four-word phrase. That's so second millennium.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Perhaps it's time for perhaps it's time to look around for a different trend to latch on to.
Right.
Yeah. That would be sort of a thing.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a very good place to pause with this episode. And I think now we've really started pulling together more in-depth scientific understandings and more in-depth challenges to religious understandings, and not in a kind of heretical sense in any way, but more just asking, what else can we learn? Where else can our faith understandings and scientific understandings take us from here? Is that basically where we're going from here in the episodes ahead?
Well, to put it pretty broadly, I mean, our conversation before we started here, we talked about going to, maybe talking a little bit about philosophy of science, and then looking at this very pervasive idea about religion and science being in altogether separate boxes. Whether we might probe that a little bit and see if there aren't some similarities between religious thinking and scientific thinking, if they're really just, complete, there's this idea that, science, the last 400 years of Western science just represents a complete break from the way that human beings have thought about anything in the past. I doubt that. I have my own sort of doubts about that. I mean, obviously, there's a sociological phenomenon of science, and things have changed, obviously drastically. But
Yeah.
I think that's overstated. Anything, I mean, and again, that goes back to this mindset of rebellion. We're always looking for this thing that you thought was common sense. It's completely false. Look at this.
Yeah.
Look at how fantastic, you thought you knew what things were. I mean, and that's, you need to be able to think that way to get to quantum physics, for example. You need to be able to accept that. You need to be able to accept that when it comes across your, when it shoots itself across your bow. You need to be able to observe it and believe it when the evidence forces you to that. But on the other hand, that's become a fad. That's just become the way of getting people's attention. And it happens over and over again in all branches of academia, and sometimes it's pretty sad.
Yeah.
Frequently in these latter days, it's pretty sad.
Well, it sounds like the path ahead for the podcast is the continuing adventure of breaking ourselves out of some traps in thinking that we've been suffering for a long time, and still having a lot of faith and trust in both science and religion, but seeing where there's potential for fresher perspectives, more holistic perspectives, more connected perspectives. Shall we leave it at that for this episode?
Yeah, we're a long way from finding any internal inconsistencies in our working hypothesis that you can believe in both science and the Catholic faith at the same time. So that's a good place to stop for here and to look forward to next episode.
Very good. Looking forward to it here too. Thanks very much, Paul, as always.
All right, thank you, Bill.
Thanks for listening to this episode of That's So Second Millennium. Our theme music, Igneous Grok, was composed and performed by Vin Marquardt. For my co-host Bill Schmidt, I'm Paul Giesting. Until next time.